My name is Matt Riley, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at Rose-Hulman. And today I'm going to be talking about a flipped model to develop improved problem identification and formulation skills in a mechanics and materials course. So just to give a little background about the course of interest here, it's EM204 as labeled at Rose, Statics and Mechanics and Materials. So this is probably most closely related to like a mechanics and materials course at most universities. We cover torsion, beam bending, combined loading, stress transformations, things of that nature. It's fundamentally taken at about the end of the second year or beginning of the third year for most students. And the course is comprised primarily of ME students with a small portion of biomedical engineers and electrical engineers sprinkled in there as well. So what's the observation that led to this study? So what we've seen is a lot of students coming out of this course have demonstrated competency with well-structured problems. I call these like your traditional textbook problems, things that are well formulated. It's just pick the right equation, plug in the right numbers, and get your solution. But they have relatively limited ability to actually extend those same principles to more complex or more realistic problems. Fundamentally, they actually have a difficult time even identifying where a statics or mechanics materials problem even exists inside of an actual real application. Like the example I've shown on the right here, if we've got an airplane wing, just fundamentally understanding that that's essentially the same thing as a cantilever beam with a distributed load on it. Just being able to make that connection of how can I use these statics and mechanics materials principles to give myself a first order model of real engineering systems is the aspect that appears to be missing coming out of this course. So my hypothesis for why this is the case, and this one kind of seems straightforward, is that, well, we present most of the problems in the course as very well structured. If you follow the traditional textbook models, most of the textbook problems are relatively well structured, well defined, given all the variables you need, only the variables you need. The problem's already been formulated in a similar manner to how it's presented in the textbook. And this is done just due to time constraints. There's a lot of material we got to cover in 10 weeks, and textbooks have resorted to isolating the individual concepts and relying on further things to develop how to connect those concepts to real problems. However, because of time constraints, we normally run out of time to make that connection, and students leave the class with either the perception that all problems that can be solved with this approach must look like one of these textbook problems, or at the very least, they're unaware of how to directly apply these principles to real problems. So my proposal is that if I flip this course and move a lot of the more foundational, straightforward material to an asynchronous delivery online, that I can spend more time in class to directly scaffold the development of these ill-structured problems. And this can be done by looking at things like application problems, case studies, design problems, basically any instance where we're taking real engineering systems, decomposing them, and seeing how we can formulate mechanics and materials problems out of those systems. So obviously I'd like to be able to benchmark the results of this study somehow. So thankfully at Rose here we teach multiple sections of the course at the same time, and we use common exams and projects amongst all of these sections of the course. So it'll give me a measure of actually measuring the quantitative effect of this implementation. So to give a brief overview of the outline of the course here, it's delivered in the Moodle learning environment. So all of the portions that are highlighted in blue would represent portions of the course that the student would interact with online in Moodle. This would be done asynchronously from the actual in-class meeting time. And then the portions in the green would primarily be done during our in-class meeting time. So a traditional, 4-credit-hour course at Rose, we'd meet 4 times a week for 50 minutes at a time. So the course structure is that the course is broken apart into 8 different modules. Each of these modules roughly represents a chapter of a textbook. It's not a one-to-one mapping, but it's a pretty fair mapping here. Topics include things like the introduction of the course, torsion of members, beams and bending, stress transformations, pressure vessels, so on and so forth. Each of these individual modules is then broken apart into anywhere from 1 to 6 topics. One can think of these topics as roughly corresponding to like sections of a textbook here. So the one shown on the right here, the lower right, is one of the module 4 stress transformation, and topics include stresses and strains on inclined planes, principal stresses, and Mohr circle. So each of these individual topics is normally what would correspond to roughly 1 day's worth of material in the traditional face-to-face delivery of this course. So it's not a direct, there's 40 topics, but that's a rough equivalency of what it would be. So now instead of spending one 50-minute face-to-face section on an individual topic, what I've done is I've broken the topic apart into fundamentally 5 different components. So the first component would be the lecture video. So prior to the actual in-class meeting corresponding to a given topic, the students would be asked to view a lecture video and complete a corresponding workbook that goes along with the lecture video that discusses the fundamental concepts that are covered in that particular topic. These lecture videos are intended to be very short. The longest one might be about 10 minutes or so, but they're generally shooting for about 5 to 10 minutes of, let's get the fundamental foundational knowledge established for this particular topic before we begin to apply it. So to assess and to kind of keep the students honest, after they do that, there's then a content quiz that they have to complete. Generally speaking, this is just a couple of simple qualitative questions that assess whether or not the students actually understand the content that was being delivered in the material. It's a way that I can kind of take a brief look at it and see, do the students actually appear to understand the basic concepts? And additionally, before the actual lecture, they have an opportunity through an anonymous questionnaire online as well, if there are any aspects that remained unclear, to make sure to note those to me so that we didn't dive in further into detail in lecture without having made sure that we're all on the same page. So the students would complete those aspects of a particular topic before the course meeting time, and then during the actual class meeting time, that time could be presented for a bunch of different things. Now we wouldn't have to worry about developing and reinforcing that foundational material, but we could spend the class time on actually applying it to things like example problems, application problems, case studies, design problems, things of that nature. So these application problems, case studies, design problems, all of those could be both, initially maybe they're the first time through, we're doing them at the topic level. So to just try to show, for instance, the topic I've shown on the right is stresses and strains on inclined planes. For instance, maybe at the beginning of that class, we would start by going through a couple of relatively simple textbook problems, just presenting the students with examples of how to actually apply that. And then I might have them work 1 or 2 problems on their own during the class meeting time. But by the end of the lecture time, what we build our way up towards is we'd look at a realistic engineering problem, and we'd try to work together to see how we can decompose and make assumptions regarding the problem itself to develop a first-order model that represents the engineering problem of interest. And this is done both at the individual topic level, and then since we're able to kind of expedite the speed at which we go through material, we're also able to do larger scale application problems, case studies, and design problems at the module level that I'll talk about here in just a minute. But the idea is once the students complete their in-class lecture portion of the course, they then have the option to go online and view a bunch of additional example problems. Since most of the examples we work on in class are relatively foundational, 1 or 2 foundational examples, and then we go through and begin to try to extend the material, I wanted to present those students who still might struggle with some of the foundational concepts the opportunity to go on and view these additional example problems. There's prompts there for them to actually try to solve the problem on their own, and if they don't get the right answer, they're then forwarded to a video of me solving the problem and explaining the concepts. So this is all things that the students are not required to do, but it's additional resources that I want to make available to them should they feel that that benefits their own learning. And then finally, to assess their performance on the topics, there's a very small number of assessment questions corresponding to each topic. Normally it's roughly 1 to 2 assessment questions per topic. You can think of these as very equivalent to the traditional homework problems in a course. And these were just competency-based questions of, do these students understand the core concepts of how to apply these to well-structured problems? They were given unlimited attempts to solve it, but they needed to get the exact right answer. There was no partial credit for this as well. And the students were assessed a small penalty, I believe it was 5% per problem for every wrong answer, just to kind of prevent, guessing at an answer over and over again until you got it. But the idea for these assessment questions was I didn't want to drill the students and have them complete a bunch of different problems to reinforce the material, but I merely wanted them to self-assess. Do they understand the material? Do they understand the core concepts? And if they self-assess themselves as not doing so, I wanted to present them with the resources that they could use to go take advantage of that. I didn't want to prescribe that all students had to complete X number of problems or anything like that. So I'm kind of trying to institute this idea of the students taking ownership of their own learning. So finally, the last part, as I mentioned, prior, is Once we'd cover all of the individual topics in a module, we would then have the extra bandwidth and time to be able to spend some time talking about application problems, case studies, design problems, things of that nature where we could tie together the more ill-structured aspect of these problems. One such case study, like I said, I've just shown on the right here, where we could look at decomposing the actual aircraft of a Boeing 747 and analyzing the spars of that aircraft as being equivalent to beams that are undergoing bending. So for these case studies, the students were presented with just the exact information that's shown on your right there, and what we would focus on is how do we actually develop a problem out of this? How do we take the material that we're given, fill in the blanks, make assumptions, and how do we actually comprise this as something that looks similar to a problem that we've solved before? And then finally, the last aspect of the course was these design problems. And these design problems were found fundamentally a little bit different in that when we assess the students' performance in the design problems, we don't assess their actual design approach. We merely assess the quality of their design itself. So for instance, if we were asking the students, one of the design problems was to ask them to design the pylon for a prosthetic leg. So what we would do is we would take the dimensions and the materials that the students would provide us. We would then evaluate what the actual factor of safety was, what the weight was, so on and so forth, compare those quantitatively, to the actual prescribed design requirements, and their grade would be directly correlated to how the quality of their design rather than the quality of their approach. So in this way, the design problems were graded in a very subjective manner. So getting into the assessment, during the fall of 2017, when this course was offered, there were 7 total sections of EM 204 offered. One of them was done with this flipped model. The other 6 were done with other faculty in the traditional model. But we had common exams and design projects among every single section of the course, and likewise we had common final exams from year to year. So it provides us with some qualitative assessment methods here to see, how well do the students actually perform compared to other data points on the qualitative aspects of it. And then finally, the quantitative assessment here, we can go through and look at the students' performance on case studies, got some directed course evaluation questions, things of that nature that we can go through and assess how the students perceive the quality of their learning in this environment. So looking at the quantitative results here, what the 3 columns represent is the first column represents the flipped version of the course that was offered in fall 2017 with 28 students. The second column represents all of the other sections of the course that were offered by other instructors in fall of 2017. So the first 2 columns do have the exact same exams and projects. The final column is a little bit different. It's the fall 2016 results with myself as the instructor, so just trying to isolate myself as a variable as well. Of note for that last column, the exams 1, 2, and 3 were different last year than this year, so I can't really make any result on the direct number comparison there, but the final exams were common from year to year. So making some conclusions out of this, it appears looking at the actual exam scores that there's no statistically significant effect of this implementation of the course on the exam scores, and this was predicted. The goal of this implementation wasn't to improve student performance on exam scores. I merely wanted to measure this to make sure that it wasn't having a negative impact on exam scores when the students were assessed in the same manner as the other students. But where we can notice an improvement is down in the bottom in the projects portion of it. It appears that in this flipped implementation of the course, the students have demonstrated a statistically significant improvement in their performance on more ill-structured problems like these design projects. Similarly, looking at more qualitative results, there were some directed questions on the course evaluations about the quality of their learning, the workload of the course, the overall course wording, and so on and so forth. So I have those. They were asked to respond on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being a positive result and 1 being a relatively negative result. And I have the data presented here for the flipped version of the course. Isolating myself as a variable, I have my results presented from last year, fall of 2016. And then also I have an aggregation of all of the results across all instructors over the last 5 years for this course. And what we can see is that based on the students' responses, they had a perceived increase in the quality of their learning, the quality of the course, and they also felt that the methods that were being utilized in the course were very beneficial as well. So this appears to match up well with the quantitative results that we actually also observed this performance, and that the students, as the quarter went on, became more proficient at actually addressing these ill-structured problems. So in summary, the preliminary results are largely positive so far. There's too little data still to draw any complete conclusions, but my plan is to implement some minor changes and reoffer this course again in the fall of next year to see if I can get some more data and see if I can draw some further conclusions from this. Now, obviously, a concern with this room is, well, how much work did this actually require? And I won't lie, it was a lot of work in order to get this implemented, but a lot of this work is heavily front-loaded, meaning it was, for the first the first time I was offering it, a lot of work, but for subsequent offerings, there's just going to be iterational improvements that I'm going to do, but most of that work is heavily front-loaded. And I'm very pleased with the results, and just the last line is merely meant to show that I'm willing to do this again, and I actually have a planned implementation of this in a materials engineering course as well for this upcoming summer. So I want to thank everyone for listening, and have a good rest of the day.